Okay, I normally like to use a remote microphone, so it's going to sound a little roomy. I'm not a big fan of this room sound, but this was a topic that keeps coming up, and I thought I would address it in a more succinct manner. I talked to a lot of people at our window that are new to precious metals and are struggling with the concept of it. Only 1 in 200 people are precious metals owners in the world, and that includes people that own on paper. So we don't even know what the numbers are for physical. And because it's not talked about, and financial planners don't talk about it, and banks don't talk about it, it's misunderstood. And so things that are misunderstood, people tend to reject. But there's a lot of people recognizing that there's a conversation going on about silver and gold and are wanting to come to the table and are urging us for answers. And of course, we can't give financial advice, so we have to sort of approach the subject in a roundabout manner. So I'm going to try to be as thorough as I can with this time. And I find that the best conversations I have with people are interactive, where I'm talking to them and they're, nodding and interjecting and asking questions, and I'm reinforcing their concerns, because it's really all about the individual and their personal concerns. But I'm going to do my best to try to replicate that conversation. So it might be a little rambling, folks. So stick with me here. I think if I can unpack this for you, this is going to help people move forward. And I went through these prostrations, if you want to call them, at some point in my journey of understanding precious metals and their role in our life. And I do say our role because they're not the only component in this question. I'm not a believer that silver and gold can solve everybody's financial problems. They're just one tool in a set of tools. I also own some cryptocurrency. I also own some stocks. I don't own any bonds right now. It's not my thing, but I do have a number of assets. And so I'm going to begin with, people are looking for a quick answer, like, should I buy gold? Is gold going to go up in price? It might. It probably will. Most people believe it will. But I will often say to people that, well, I'm fine with gold and silver staying at the price they are right now. And people are shocked to hear that. Well, number one, I can accumulate more of them with the dollars that I have in the meantime. And what I'm watching is other assets go down in value. You say, well, how does that matter to the price of gold? Well, it matters because, so let's start with first principles. My first principle is that if you don't want to, this is just my opinion, don't take this as financial advice. This is just my opinion. But if you find that this opinion is useful to you, then that's all that really matters. So my first principle is that if you don't want to be poor the rest of your life, you need to own some assets. And because paper currency can't translate value over time, you can't save in dollars, right? And people inherently don't ever save in dollars. Like, people don't put dollars in shoe boxes anymore. Why? Well, most people save their asset value in a home. And while there's nothing wrong with that, a home is only one asset in what I believe should be a mix of assets. And why, so let's go back to first principles. First principle is we should own assets if we don't want to be poor. Second principle in my mind should be we should own multiple different assets. Now, why is that? Well, because each asset has different characteristics to it, and they have different cycles of highs and lows. Real estate goes through a much longer cycle than, say, cryptocurrency does. Bitcoin is on about a 3-year cycle. Real estate, well, in recent years, real estate's on an extremely exaggerated long cycle, but typically it's about an 8 to 10 year cycle of highs and lows in real estate. Right now, we're in some extremes in that, and without going into too much depth. Bonds and stocks are on a similar type of cycle, but individual stocks can perform, on shorter or longer cycles. So why is that relevant? Because assets, in my opinion, in another principle, are tools in a toolkit, in a financial toolkit. So the last thing we want to do is liquidate an asset when it's at a low price. Now we're back to price again. Now, I'm not saying that, price doesn't matter, but it may not matter as much as which asset that we focus on in a given at a given time period. Because the purpose, in my mind, to owning different assets is, so, as I said, I believe they're tools in a toolkit. So what do we use tools for? Well, to build and to fix things. So we use these tools to build up a portfolio of assets that we can save over time, that we can always use if we need to liquidate them to have, your daily needs met, right? We always need our daily needs. We need heat and light and food and transportation and, meaningful things to do so that we can feel human. And all of those things, we can typically take care of with our current income and different things like that if we balance things out correctly. But there are going to be times of stress in people's financial world, and we're beginning to see that right now. For example, inflation is really hitting people hard, and we're seeing a lot of people cash in their assets. Now, a lot of people don't want to have to do that. They'd like to hang on to their gold and silver and stuff. And I think that's a great idea to hold on to it as long as you possibly can. But should you need it in the meantime, now you have a liquidatable asset in a toolkit that you can reach for. And as much as you may, lament the idea of having to cash in some of your gold and silver prematurely, the fact that you actually have it is important. And I always remind people of that when they have a long face and they're cashing it in. I said, well, look, number one, you don't have to stop. It doesn't mean it's over for you. It simply means it's a setback. But what if you didn't have that? What would you do if you didn't have the gold and silver to cash in, being that they're very liquid and almost always a buyer for them? Again, that is another important feature of gold and silver. I'm rambling here, but I'll try to get back on track. So taking that individual snapshot of a person, having to go through that, there's a negative to it, of course, but there's a positive to it. You actually have that asset there to solve whatever problem it is. Like I've had people come in and say, I got to make a mortgage payment because my mortgage went up. So they're cashing in some gold, but you have it. That's good news, because that's the purpose of tools in a toolkit, to use them when you need them. Very difficult to liquidate a house. That's a feature of a home. A home is important an asset, but a home is a kind of an asset that we really need to rely on. It's also a place to live, it's shelter, it's security, it's a lot of other things other than just an asset. And because of the nature of those things inside that asset, that's even more reason to have other assets that are liquidatable: stocks, bonds, crypto, precious metals, fine art if necessary. You could buy collector guitars as an asset. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good asset, but it could be. I recently bought a guitar from a fellow that was selling off his guitar collection because inflation and shutdowns during the past 3 years had harmed his business. And thankfully, he had some guitars to sell and to recoup some of those asset values so that he could put out other fires in his life. So good on him that he actually had something that he could liquidate. And now he can, when things get better, he can always go and reacquire those assets if they mean something to him. And so there's an example of somebody that had a mix of assets. Now, guitars are an unusual one, but at least there's something real that can be resold into the market and collect dollars to put out fires in other areas of their life. In this case, it was to save his business. And so that's good, because his business is now getting back on track and things are improving. So what if he didn't have those guitars? He would have been, restricted to either running up his line of credit on his house if that was available to him. May or may not have been, depends on his situation. I mean, if he was a new buyer, just bought his home in the recent years, he wouldn't have enough asset value there to even collect on. So that would be an issue. So, this is an important distinction, that he had some assets to liquidate. So back to first principles, have multiple different assets. So when people are questioning me about buying gold and silver, often they're asking very rudimentary, basic questions. Well, do you think it's going to go up? Is this a good time to buy gold? Well, in my opinion, it's always a good time to buy new assets if you don't have anything other than your home. As I just demonstrated with this fellow with the guitars, now that could have been bars of gold or bars of silver or Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency as well that he could have liquidated had he chose to, if he'd had those various asset mixes. So in my opinion, and for me, what it comes down to is not so much whether gold and silver, it's a good time to buy it. If the only asset I had was my house, the most important thing is to get into different assets. Now, obviously, we don't want to just go out there and buy any old asset. We don't want to start buying scrap cars necessarily if we're not a scrap dealer. That might be an asset to a scrap dealer, but we want to buy things that make sense for us. So for the average homeowner, the average working person, just diversifying into some gold and silver is a start. Even if you didn't understand anything else, then, hey, I need some different assets in my mix, that would be a good start towards that goal, because I think that's the first principle, is having more than one asset, as I said right at the beginning. So for me, the question is not, is gold going to go up or down in value? There's a number of reasons why that doesn't matter, which I'll try not to belabor at this point. The point now being that first principles being own more assets, you should just start, maybe buy some, some gold, silver, buy some Bitcoin, buy other things. And in particular, right now, with real estate stocks and bonds decreasing in value, alternative assets are becoming far more popular. Just saying that if you're looking at this for the first time, you're in good company, because a lot of people are now coming to the table and realizing most of our people coming in are new people or repeat customers, but we're getting a lot of new people. And this tells me that there's a sentiment out there that's on the wind, that's picking up speed, that people are moving into this and away from other types of assets. Because typically what people do is they turn to their financial planner, turn to their, the people at their bank and say, what should I do? Well, there seems to be a migration from that right now, which shows a different sentiment in the world. So the people that are a little bit more investigative and curious are starting to stumble onto this, because once you start to look at alternative information, if you go to YouTube or some other, searches on Google, what are some alternative assets? Is this a good time to have alternative assets? You're going to find a real strong conversation going on in our community and others, that there's a big movement towards alternative assets, meaning stocks, bonds, and real estate being the mainstream. There seems to be a move away from that, and it's because for the first time in history right now, this thing we call the everything bubble, meaning typically with the big asset classes where the big money plays around, the stocks, bond, and real estate, they're typically on different cycles, that one is up and the other is down, and people will cycle back and forth between stocks and bonds. Occasionally they'll take their asset mix and change the allocation slightly as valuations change. But for the first time in history, those big three asset classes are actually going down in value simultaneously. This is a very odd anomaly. People are calling it the everything bubble. And this really has a lot to do with money creation and injection of capital into the economy since the quantitative easing of the 2008 financial crisis has blown up asset values into really ridiculous, the point of ridiculous now that it's unaffordable for most people. So this is creating a dynamic and a trend that's playing itself out very, very slowly. These are very, very large markets, and very, very large markets don't go through these changes quickly. It takes a long time for people to, for example, in real estate, to change their mind about where they are, what their priorities are in that, and then to act on those changes, because it's a big decision for a lot of people to do something as drastic as, sell your home and buy a different home or a lesser home, or get out of, ownership and get into rental, or sell and move in with somebody else. This is happening to a lot of people now because they're finding it unaffordable to maintain and own a home. I recently bought a car from a fellow, and because inflation is hitting him and he's on a fixed income, he simply couldn't afford to. He has company vehicle available to him, and he's looking at the cost of owning this car that he had, and he had to sell it. So this is happening to a lot of people right now. It's a trickle that we eventually believe will turn into a torrent. So the question about getting back to talking our book, which is gold and silver precious metals, the question of whether or not it is a good time to buy it is really immaterial if you go back to first principles, that you should be in different types of assets, if not for no other reason, just to have some different tools in your toolkit, because your home can only take you so far. If you run into distress with your home, it comes down to, well, I don't want to liquidate my home, I'm going to have to take out a line of credit against it. But that, if you're already having a problem that's most likely credit related, because most people's problems right now are credit related, then that is just furthering that problem. You're just borrowing yourself into it. The key to getting out of a hole is to stop digging. And if you're just borrowing against that house and you're already in financial distress, you're digging yourself deeper. And it seems like a potential solution because it stops the problem in the short term, but it adds to the problem down the road. And this is unfortunately where a lot of people are headed right now, because they don't practice the first principle, which is to own multiple different assets. So this was a big, hard lesson for me to learn, because I started out with the same, the first time I bought and owned silver, I was always watching the price, watching the price, watching the price. And I thought, if you got out of dollars and into an asset like that, there must have been a reason for that. So what is the hurry to get back into dollars? Oh, because I want more of them, because I want to do what? Well, hopefully buy another asset, because if that's, my only asset at the time, obviously I'm breaking my first principle, which is owning multiple different assets. So this is the beginning of a very deep conversation. I mean, this goes on all the time with people that I talk to, because when they start out with overly simple questions like, do you think gold is going to go up in price? Well, it's not a matter of whether I think it is. The majority of the analysts in the world believe it is. But regardless of that belief, I again don't ascribe to the price going up is necessarily the most important thing. For example, I was doing a talk for some people at a group meeting. There was about 200 people present, and in the question and answer session afterwards, a fellow asked me about, well, silver's been so flat for so long, and I'm a Bitcoin guy. It must have been important for him to tell me that. I guess he was making it a bit of a contest question, like my asset against my favorite asset against your favorite asset. And I said, Bitcoin's, and this was at a time when Bitcoin was very close to its peak a couple of years back. And so he was pretty proud of his choice, and rightly so. I still believe Bitcoin is a great asset to own. I own a small amount of it relative to other assets, but needless to say, I'm acquiring more of it as we go. I think in the future, it's going to be a very important one. So for that reason, I'm practicing my first principle and collecting it. But what I said to the guy at the time was, just as an example, I said, well, a lot of people believe that Bitcoin may go over 100,000, but will it? Are we sure? I mean, there's a lot of people talking at that point. Max Kaiser was a big Bitcoin guy at the time out there, and he was saying it was going to go to 220. That was his call. Now, it never did reach 220. It turned around and went back, and it went down into the low 20s or even below 20 briefly. I think it broke down to 18. I haven't really kept that accurate track of it, but I know it got down around 20. So if it was around 80,000 Canadian at the time, and silver was around $30, well, silver is still around $30. It hasn't moved, but now Bitcoin is dropped down to, like, say 20. It's at about 30 Canadian right now, but at one time it was at 20. Regardless of whether my silver moved at all, if I was so inclined, I could have taken my silver holdings that, according to this fella, were stagnant, and I could have then moved them into Bitcoin and bought multiples of Bitcoin relative to the $80,000 price it was then. I could have bought 4 times as much with my boring, stagnant, silver price. So one of the things that people never consider is that, something staying stagnant, because if we're going to own multiple different assets, and we're going to continue to do that, what we want to look is one of those assets reaching its zenith? Is it getting near its maximum potential price? Well, if that's the case, then we could always trade that for multiples of a lesser priced asset. And then when this asset rises up, if we feel it's near a peak, we can look and see if there are other assets within our asset class that we can move some of that capital into and begin cycling around. And what ends up happening then is you end up avoiding this channel of moving up and down in a range and having this average constantly. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but if you take this holistic approach and look at multiple different assets in a basket that belongs to you, you can now start to position your choices. And nobody says you have to get completely out of one position. You can simply say, well, I think it would be better to own a little larger percentage of this asset over here. And as I'm not saying any particular asset, because again, back to first principles, we should own multiple within a basket, and then we can make choices about how to move capital around within those various different assets within that basket. Therefore, getting the most out of the dollars as they go forward, because dollars are an elastic thing. They're an elastic type of measurement. And what we want to do is use that flexibility in the dollar, while this is an anomaly and a thing in our financial world, this use of the dollar, and position those dollars in different assets to take advantage of higher valuations and therefore gain more multiples of real things with the same amount of dollars. So that is a little bit of a roundabout, convoluted explanation, but if you're paying attention and charting this out and doing it in your own world, you'll see over time that this really does matter. Now, gold and silver are great assets on a long-term cycle. I always give this example of a woman that walked into our store and she had the original paperwork from when her mother had bought these two 10-ounce gold bars from Scotiabank years ago. They were old Scotiabank bars minted by Johnson Matthey, and she brought them in to cash in. And she had the original receipt. Her mother had given her the original receipt as validation. She wanted us to see that. Well, this is the original receipt. And I said, "Oh, that's great. And, oh, I see that she only paid $4,800 for these two gold bars back around 25 years ago." And now she could have just simply took the $4,800 and put it in a shoebox and given that to her daughter, and her daughter would have had $4,800 and no need to visit our store. But she didn't do that. She converted that cash into gold bars. And then 25 years hence, her daughter came into our store and walked out with nearly $50,000 as opposed to $4,800 that would have been presented to her in either a shoebox or an envelope 20 to 25 years later. So it demonstrates the increase in price and valuation over a long period of time. Obviously, she could buy a lot more multiples of other assets now, pay down a lot more mortgage payments with $50,000 than she could with $4,800. So I like to use examples as a validation for what I'm saying. Now, again, that's back to price. But I'm not saying price doesn't matter. It's just not my first consideration. Because I'm looking at multiple different assets, I'm looking at relative values. So price could be important if you have one asset, you have two assets that are evenly, pegged right now, evenly pegged on value. And this one goes down a little bit and this goes up a little bit. Well, if this one were to stay here, you have one multiple, but if it moves an equal amount up, now you have a two multiple. So I'm not saying that price is not important. Again, I'm saying it's a secondary consideration. Price is just a measurement in time to see where you're at so that you can compare to another asset. It's really just a comparative thing. I always say that a currency only has value currently. I want you to remember that mantra because it'll help you to understand, we have to compare when we're measuring what's happened to assets over time because they do move in dollar value over time, and we're using dollars as our measuring stick. We need to compare to see, should we be moving from this asset to this asset, preferably from an overvalued or near overvalued asset. That's another thing. Timing the top of a market is nearly impossible for even the best out there. So what we have to do is we have to make these decisions before it becomes imminent. There's some very famous traders that have said, I don't care about the top 20 or bottom 20% of the market, only the middle. And that's sage advice because, again, it's very hard to time markets. So if you feel a sense that, hey, this is an overvalued asset and this is an undervalued asset in my basket, and I own some of these, it might be time to trade some or all of one asset for another so that you can ride its valuation up and do the same trade for another undervalued asset over time. So this is a lot of convoluted repetition of the same thing, but I feel this is a conversation that really needs to be hammered over and over again because we've been basically brainwashed into thinking dollars are a standard for measurement, and they're only a standard in real time. Over time, dollars can't translate value or give you an accurate picture of what the value of an asset is until we compare it to another asset. I often always say all values are relative as well. So currency only has value currently, and all values are relative. So we need a comparative standard using something in real time to measure the difference. And that's where those two axioms and those two tools come into your field of view when you're dealing with a basket of assets. So back to that again, right back to first principles. So I hope this conversation helps. I know it's a bit convoluted, a bit winding around, but we're really talking about something that you almost have to get your own head around this and understand this. I'm going to link some of my previous videos about value and different aspects of this conversation in the show notes below. So check that out, and I hope that gets you guys more on track. you folks to understanding, you know, that price is a thing, but it's not the only thing. Okay, so thanks for listening, folks. I hope that helps. Have a great day.